The hum of the refrigerator was the loudest sound in the house, a dull drone that seemed to mirror the emptiness settling in my chest. I stared at the half-eaten plate of pasta on the kitchen counter, the sauce congealing into a disturbing shade of orange. Eleonora had made it, or rather, had said she'd made it. These days, it was hard to distinguish between her words and the reality they supposedly represented. They were becoming increasingly detached, like echoes in a canyon, beautiful in their initial sound but ultimately hollow and reverberating with nothing but the emptiness around them. 10 years. 10 years we'd been married. 10 years I thought I knew her, thought I understood the intricate tapestry of her soul. 10 years reduced to this gnawing suspicion, this cold dread that coiled in my gut every time she walked out the door, every time her phone buzzed with a message I wasn't allowed to see. It wasn't just the late nights anymore, the whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when I entered the room. It was something deeper, a shift in the very air between us, a subtle but undeniable change in the way she looked at me, or rather, the way she didn't look at me. Her eyes, once pools of warm affection, now seemed distant, preoccupied, as if she were constantly calculating some complex equation I wasn't privy to. I remember the day we met, a lifetime ago it felt. She was laughing, her head thrown back, sunlight catching the strands of her auburn hair. I was captivated instantly, drawn to her vivacity, her infectious joy. We'd spent hours talking that day, discovering shared passions, unspoken connections. It felt like destiny, a meeting of souls. And for 10 years I believed it was. I cherished her, worshipped her almost. I built my world around her. My hopes, my dreams, my very identity intertwined with hers. Now that world was crumbling, the foundations shaking with every unanswered question, every unexplained absence. I picked up the plate of pasta, the ceramic cold against my fingertips. I scraped the uneaten food into the trash, the metallic clang echoing in the quiet kitchen. The uneaten meal felt symbolic, a representation of all the things left unsaid, all the emotions left unfelt. I ran a hand through my hair, the strands feeling brittle and lifeless. I needed answers. I deserved them, but more than that, I needed to understand. How could the woman I loved, the woman I trusted with my heart, become this stranger, this enigma wrapped in secrets and lies? The thought settled in my stomach like a stone, heavy and unmovable. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I couldn't ignore it any longer. The time for blind faith was over. The time for truth, however painful it might be, had begun. The silence of the house was suffocating. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to mock me, each tick a metronome counting down to some unknown, and undoubtedly unpleasant, revelation. I wandered into the living room, the familiar space suddenly feeling alien. Eleonora's perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and sandalwood, still lingered in the air, a phantom presence that both comforted and tormented me. I picked up a framed photograph from the mantelpiece, our wedding day. Eleonora, radiant in her white dress, her smile dazzling, her eyes sparkling with love, or at least what I thought was love. My own smile in the picture seemed forced, almost apprehensive, a stark contrast to her unrestrained joy. Was it a premonition? Some subconscious awareness of the pain to come? I traced the outline of her face in the photograph, my fingers lingering on the smooth glass. How could this woman I had vowed to love and cherish, betray me so deeply? The question echoed in my mind, a relentless drumbeat of confusion and hurt. I had always been a good husband, a provider, a loyal and devoted partner. I had given her everything, poured my heart and soul into our relationship. And this was how she repaid me? With deceit, with lies, with a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound? The thought of her with another man, or men, sent a wave of nausea through me. The images that flashed through my mind were fragmented, distorted, fueled by suspicion and imagination. I tried to push them away, but they clung to me like shadows, whispering insidious doubts and fears. I felt a burning rage building inside me, a primal instinct to protect what was mine, to avenge the wrong that had been done to me. But beneath the anger, there was a deeper, more profound pain. The pain of betrayal. The pain of losing the woman I loved. The pain of realizing that the life we had built together was nothing but a carefully constructed illusion. I placed the photograph back on the mantelpiece, my hands shaking. I knew I couldn't stay in this house, surrounded by the ghosts of our past, haunted by the specter of her infidelity. I needed to escape, to find some semblance of peace, some clarity in the chaos that had engulfed my life. I grabbed my keys and wallet and walked out the door, the silence of the house following me like a shroud. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there, not for another minute. I needed to breathe, to think, to try to make sense of the shattered pieces of my life. The night air was cool against my skin, a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the house. I started the car, the engine's rumble a small distraction from the turmoil in my mind. As I drove away, I looked back at the house, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. It looked so normal, so peaceful, so untouched by the darkness that lurked within its walls. And in that moment, I knew that I couldn't let this go. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine, that my life hadn't been irrevocably changed. I had to know the truth, however painful it might be, and I had to make her pay. The city lights blurred into streaks of color as I drove, the rhythmic hum of the engine a poor substitute for the thoughts racing through my mind. Where could I go? Who could I turn to? The friends we shared, the couples we socialized with, suddenly seemed suspect, their smiles and laughter tainted with the possibility of complicity. Had they known? Had they seen the signs, the subtle shifts in Eleanor's behavior that I had so blindly missed? The thought made my stomach churn, the betrayal multiplying with each imagined knowing glance, each shared joke that now seemed laced with hidden meaning. I found myself driving aimlessly, the streets unfamiliar, the landmarks foreign. I ended up at a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, a place I had never been before, a place where no one knew my name, no one knew my story. I ordered a drink, the amber liquid burning its way down my throat, offering a momentary distraction from the gnawing pain in my chest. The bar was mostly empty, a few solitary figures hunched over their drinks, lost in their own private worlds. I envied them their anonymity, their freedom from the crushing weight of betrayal. As I sat there, nursing my drink, the events of the past few weeks replayed in my mind, each memory a fresh wound. The missed calls, the unexplained absences, the whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when I entered the room. The time she had worked late, but her car was nowhere to be found in the office parking lot. The weekend getaway with her girlfriends, where she'd forgotten her phone, leaving me with no way to contact her. The lies, the deceit, the carefully constructed facade of normalcy that she had maintained while living a double life behind my back. Each memory fueled the anger burning inside me, a righteous fury that demanded justice, that craved retribution. But how? How could I possibly make her understand the depth of her betrayal, the pain she had inflicted? How could I make her pay for shattering the life we had built together, for destroying the trust that had been the foundation of our relationship? I finished my drink, the ice clinking in the empty glass. I needed to do something, anything, to break free from this paralysis, this overwhelming sense of helplessness. I couldn't let her win, couldn't let her walk away from this unscathed. I had to fight back, had to reclaim my life, my dignity, my sense of self. But where to begin? The question hung in the air, unanswered, a daunting challenge in the face of my overwhelming despair. As I left the bar, the cool night air hit me like a slap, a sobering reminder of the reality I had to face. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but I knew I couldn't give up. I had to find a way to fight back, to make her pay for the devastation she had wrought. The next morning, the harsh sunlight streaming through my bedroom window felt like an intrusion, a cruel reminder of the stark reality I had to face. The events of the previous night, the aimless driving, the solitary drink in the dimly lit bar, seemed like a fever dream, a distorted reflection of the turmoil within me. Yet, the pain in my chest, the gnawing emptiness in my gut, were all too real. I couldn't go to work, couldn't face the mundane routine, the forced smiles, the the pretense of normalcy. I called in sick, my voice hoarse, my words barely audible. The woman on the other end of the line, oblivious to the storm raging within me, offered her perfunctory condolences and hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, its silence a stark contrast to the cacophony in my mind. I needed a plan, a strategy to navigate this treacherous terrain, to reclaim my life from the wreckage of betrayal. But where to start? The legal route, with its drawn-out proceedings and public airing of dirty laundry, held little appeal. I didn't want to drag our lives through the mud, didn't want to subject myself to the scrutiny and judgment of strangers. I wanted something more personal, more targeted, something that would hit Eleonora where it hurt the most, her carefully constructed image, her web of deceit. An idea began to form in my mind, a seed of vengeance taking root in the fertile ground of my pain. I wouldn't confront her directly, wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing my anguish. I would play the long game, gather evidence, uncover the full extent of her betrayal. I would become a shadow, a silent observer, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. I started by discreetly monitoring her activities, tracking her movements, noting the times she was absent, the calls she received, the messages she exchanged. I installed a hidden camera in our bedroom, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The footage confirmed my worst fears. Eleonora wasn't just having a single affair. She was involved with multiple men. The images seared themselves into my memory, each encounter a fresh betrayal, a deeper wound. The anger within me intensified, fueled by the undeniable evidence of her deceit. But I couldn't let it consume me, couldn't let it cloud my judgment. I needed to stay focused, to channel my rage into a carefully calculated plan of revenge. I would make her pay, not just for the infidelity, but for the lies, the manipulation, the years of stolen trust. I would expose her true nature to the world, strip away the mask of innocence she wore so well. And I would do it on my own terms, in my own time, with a precision and ruthlessness that would leave her reeling. The days that followed were a blur of clandestine activity, a relentless pursuit of information, a desperate attempt to piece together the puzzle of Eleonora's betrayal. I delved into her phone records, scrutinizing every call, every text message, every email. I followed her discreetly, my heart pounding in my chest each time I caught a glimpse of her with another man. I hired a private investigator, a gruff, no-nonsense man named Frank, who seemed to possess an uncanny ability to unearth secrets. Frank's initial findings were both shocking and devastating. Eleonora's affairs weren't just casual flings. They were deeply intertwined with our social circle, our lives. One of the men was a colleague, a man I had considered a friend, someone I had confided in about my worries and suspicions. Another was a neighbor, a friendly face I often exchanged greetings with, a man whose wife and children played with ours. The third, and perhaps the most shocking of all, was a distant relative, a man who had been a guest in our home, who had shared meals with us, who had laughed and joked with Eleonora while I sat oblivious, trusting and unsuspecting. The realization that her betrayal extended so deeply into our lives, that it had been happening right under my nose, filled me with a sense of nausea. The world I thought I knew, the people I thought I could trust, suddenly seemed like strangers, their smiles and gestures now imbued with a sinister undertone. I felt like a fool, a naive pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. But with each revelation, the anger within me grew stronger, hardening into a steely resolve. I wouldn't let them get away with this, wouldn't let them destroy my life without consequence. I would use their secrets against them, expose their hypocrisy, turn their own betrayals against them. I would become the puppet master, pulling the strings, orchestrating their downfall with a cold, calculating precision. Frank and I spent hours poring over the evidence, strategizing, plotting our next move. We uncovered hidden bank accounts, secret rendezvous points, compromising photographs. Each discovery fueled my determination, each piece of information adding another layer to my plan of revenge. I would make them pay, every single one of them. I would make them regret the day they ever crossed my path, the day they ever dared to betray my trust. The weight of my secret knowledge was a heavy burden to bear. Every casual encounter, Every social gathering became a minefield of hidden meanings and veiled threats. I found myself watching everyone with suspicion, analyzing their every word, every gesture, for any hint of complicity in Eleanora's deception. The world, once a familiar and comforting place, had become a stage for a twisted play, and I, the unwitting protagonist, was forced to play my part while silently plotting my revenge. The first target on my list was Mark, the colleague. He was a rising star in the company, ambitious and ruthless, with a carefully cultivated image of family man and loyal friend. I knew his weakness was his reputation, his carefully constructed facade of respectability. Frank, with his network of informants, had uncovered evidence of Mark's involvement in some shady business dealings, transactions that skirted the edges of legality. It wasn't enough to destroy him completely, but it was enough to tarnish his image, to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of his superiors. I anonymously leaked the information to the company's internal audit department, along with a few carefully chosen rumors about Mark's personal life. The effect was immediate and devastating. Mark was called in for questioning, his projects were put on hold, and his reputation within the company plummeted. I watched from the sidelines, a silent observer, as his carefully constructed world began to crumble. The satisfaction I felt was a bitter pill to swallow, tinged with a sadness for the friendship we had once shared, the trust that had been so carelessly betrayed. Next on my list was Robert, the neighbor. He was a pillar of the community, a respected businessman with a seemingly perfect family life. But behind the facade of suburban bliss, Robert harbored a dark secret, a gambling addiction that had spiraled out of control. Frank had discovered that Robert was deeply in debt, owing vast sums of money to some unsavory characters. He was desperate, vulnerable, and ripe for exploitation. I contacted Robert's creditors, anonymously of course, and offered to settle his debts in exchange for a small favor. The favor was simple: to make Robert's life a living hell. They were more than happy to oblige. Within days, Robert's world was turned upside down. His credit cards were maxed out, his bank accounts were frozen, and his house was threatened with foreclosure. His wife, oblivious to the true extent of his problems, was devastated. The perfect family image that Robert had so carefully cultivated was shattered, replaced by a reality of debt, deceit, and despair. With each successful act of revenge, the anger within me began to subside, replaced by a cold, calculating determination. I was no longer the victim, the wounded husband seeking retribution. I was the architect of their downfall, the puppet master pulling the strings, the dispenser of justice. And I wouldn't stop until they had all paid the price for their betrayal. The final member of Eleanora's clandestine lover's circle was Stephen, the distant relative. Of the three, he was perhaps the most insidious, his betrayal cutting deeper because of the familial bond, the assumed trust that came with it. Stephen was a chameleon, a master manipulator who hid his true nature behind a mask of charm and affability. He was also, as Frank discovered, a deeply insecure man, obsessed with his public image and terrified of scandal. My plan for Stephen was more subtle, more psychological. I decided to play on his insecurities, to exploit his fear of exposure. I began by planting rumors about his infidelity, whispers that reached his wife, his colleagues, his friends. I created anonymous social media accounts, posting cryptic messages and veiled threats, hinting at his secret life. I even sent him anonymous letters, filled with innuendo and thinly veiled accusations. The effect on Stephen was dramatic. He became withdrawn, paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder. His work suffered, his relationships deteriorated, and his carefully constructed world began to unravel. He suspected everyone, trusted no one, and the constant fear of exposure gnawed at him like a disease. I watched his descent into paranoia with a detached satisfaction. It wasn't the explosive, public downfall I had orchestrated for Mark and Robert, but it was no less effective. Stephen was a prisoner of his own fears, trapped in a web of suspicion and doubt that I had spun around him. He was a living example of the adage that revenge is a dish best served cold. With each act of revenge, I felt a sense of control returning to my life. The helplessness, the despair, the overwhelming sense of betrayal began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard determination. I was no longer the victim, the wounded husband seeking retribution. I was the master of my own fate, the architect of their downfall, the dispenser of justice. And I wouldn't stop until Eleonora herself had paid the ultimate price for her treachery. Eleonora remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. She continued her clandestine affairs, her lies becoming more elaborate, her absences more frequent. I watched her, a silent observer, studying her every move, memorizing her every expression. The anger I felt towards her was a complex emotion, a mixture of hurt, betrayal, and a strange, twisted sense of fascination. How could she be so callous, so indifferent to the pain she was causing? How could she live this double life, this charade of normalcy, without a flicker of remorse? I knew the time was coming to confront her, to expose her betrayal and unleash the full force of my revenge. But I wasn't ready yet. I needed to gather more evidence, to build an airtight case, to ensure that she couldn't deny her actions, couldn't wriggle out of the consequences. I continued to monitor her activities, tracking her movements, recording her conversations, documenting every lie, every deception. I became a shadow, a ghost, always present, always watching, but never seen. The information I gathered was damning, a testament to her infidelity and her utter disregard for our marriage. But the more I learned, the more I realized that revenge wasn't enough. It wouldn't erase the pain, wouldn't heal the wounds, wouldn't bring back the life we had lost. I needed something more, something that would force her to confront the consequences of her actions, to understand the depth of her betrayal. I decided to take a different approach, one that would strike at the very core of her being, one that would expose her not just to the world, but to herself. I would create a mirror, a reflection of her own deceit, a stark reminder of the damage she had caused. I would make her see herself as I saw her, as the world would see her, stripped bare of her lies and pretenses. The plan began to take shape in my mind, a masterpiece of manipulation, a symphony of destruction. I would use her own weapons against her, her own lies, her own deceptions, to weave a web of intrigue that would ensnare her, expose her, and ultimately destroy her. It would be a slow, agonizing process, a descent into madness that would leave her broken and defeated. And I, the architect of her downfall, would watch from the shadows, a silent witness to her destruction, the final act of my revenge. My plan was audacious, risky, and undeniably cruel. But it was also, in my twisted mind, a work of art, a masterpiece of manipulation designed to expose Eleonora's true nature and make her pay for her sins. I would use her own vanity, her obsession with appearances, against her. I would create a false reality, a world where her lies were truth, her deceptions celebrated, her betrayals rewarded. I started by subtly altering her environment, planting seeds of doubt and suspicion in her mind. I would leave ambiguous messages on her phone, accidental pocket dials with snippets of fabricated conversations, and anonymous gifts with cryptic notes. I created fake social media profiles, mirroring her own, but with subtle differences, hinting at a secret life, a hidden persona. At first, the changes were subtle, almost imperceptible. But as the weeks passed, the doubts grew, the suspicions intensified. Eleonora became increasingly agitated, paranoid, convinced that she was being watched, followed, manipulated. Her carefully constructed world began to crack, the facade of normalcy crumbling under the weight of my carefully orchestrated deception. I watched her unravel with a detached fascination, a scientist observing a lab rat in a carefully controlled experiment. Her confidence eroded, her laughter faded, her eyes took on a haunted look. The woman I had once loved, the woman who had captivated me with her vivacity and charm, was disappearing, replaced by a hollow shell, a ghost of her former self. The next stage of my plan was more daring, more risky. I began to introduce real people into her false reality, actors hired to play specific roles, to feed her paranoia, to confirm her suspicions. There was the concerned friend, who confided in her about rumors of her infidelity, The private investigator, who warned her of a stalker, the secret admirer, who sent her cryptic messages and expensive gifts. Eleonora, already teetering on the edge of sanity, was completely taken in. She believed every lie, every deception, every carefully crafted illusion. She became a prisoner of her own paranoia, trapped in a world of my creation, a world where reality and fantasy blurred, where truth and lies were indistinguishable. And I, the puppet master, watched from the shadows, pulling the strings, orchestrating her downfall, savoring the sweet taste of revenge. The climax of my plan was a carefully orchestrated event, a grand finale designed to expose Eleanor's betrayal to the world and shatter her carefully constructed image. I chose a public setting, a charity gala attended by our friends, colleagues, and acquaintances, a place where appearances mattered, where reputations were made and broken. I arranged for Eleonora to receive an anonymous invitation, a cryptic message promising a revelation that would change her life. Intrigued and apprehensive, she attended the gala, unaware that she was walking into a trap of my own making. At the gala, I orchestrated a series of accidental encounters, staged conversations, and planted evidence, all designed to confirm her suspicions, to feed her paranoia. The concerned friend reappeared, this time with proof of her infidelity, fabricated photos and messages that seemed irrefutable. The private investigator approached her, warning her of a stalker who was obsessed with her, who was planning to expose her secrets to the world. As the evening progressed, Eleonora became increasingly agitated, her eyes darting nervously around the room, her hands trembling. The carefully constructed facade she had maintained for so long began to crumble, the mask of normalcy slipping away, revealing the fear and panic beneath. Then, at the carefully chosen moment, I made my move. I arranged for a video to be played on the large screens in the ballroom, a montage of images and recordings documenting her infidelity, her lies, her betrayals. The room fell silent as the images flashed across the screens, the evidence of her deception undeniable, irrefutable. Eleonora, caught in the spotlight, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock and horror, tried to deny the accusations, to protest her innocence. But her words were drowned out by the gasps of disbelief, the murmurs of disapproval, the looks of disgust from the people she had once considered friends and confidants. Her carefully constructed world imploded. The image she had so painstakingly cultivated shattered into a million pieces. The humiliation was complete, the downfall absolute. She fled the gala in disgrace, her reputation in ruins, her life in shambles. The aftermath of the gala was swift and brutal. Eleonora became a pariah, ostracized by her friends, shunned by her colleagues, and abandoned by her family. The whispers followed her everywhere, the judgment in every eye, the condemnation in every word. The life she had known, the world she had built, was gone, replaced by a desolate landscape of isolation and shame. She tried to defend herself, to explain her actions, to plead for understanding. But her words fell on deaf ears. Her pleas for forgiveness met with scorn and derision. The evidence was too damning, the betrayal too deep, the wounds too raw. The men she had been involved with, Mark, Robert, and Stephen, also suffered the consequences of their actions. Their reputations were tarnished, their careers damaged, their families shattered. They became pariahs in their own right, outcasts in a society that valued loyalty and condemned betrayal. I watched their downfall with a mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. The revenge I had craved, the justice I had sought, had been served. But the victory felt hollow, the satisfaction fleeting. The pain of Eleanor's betrayal remained, a deep ache in my heart, a constant reminder of the life we had lost. In the quiet moments, when the anger subsided and the thirst for revenge was quenched, I found myself wondering if it had all been worth it. Had I become the very thing I despised, a manipulator, a deceiver, a destroyer of lives? Had I sacrificed my own integrity in the pursuit of justice? The questions haunted me, their answers elusive, their implications troubling. I had won the battle, but at what cost? Had I lost myself in the process? Had I become a monster in the name of revenge? Eleonora, stripped bare of her social armor, Her carefully cultivated persona shattered, retreated into the shadows. The once vibrant and outgoing woman became a recluse, hiding from the judgmental eyes of the world, the whispers that followed her like a curse. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, became a tomb, its silence a constant reminder of her isolation. I, the architect of her downfall, the orchestrator of her destruction, found myself unexpectedly drawn back into her orbit. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was a lingering sense of responsibility, or perhaps it was simply the morbid curiosity of a man who had witnessed the consequences of his own actions. I would visit her occasionally, finding her curled up on the couch, her eyes vacant, her spirit broken. We would sit in silence, the air thick with unspoken words, the ghosts of our past hovering between us. I would bring her groceries, make sure she was eating, that the basic necessities of life were met. She would accept my offerings with a mute gratitude, her eyes filled with a mixture of shame and a strange, unsettling flicker of defiance. In those quiet moments, I saw a different Eleonora, a woman stripped of her pretenses, her vulnerabilities exposed. The anger I had felt towards her began to soften, replaced by a strange mix of pity and a reluctant admiration for her resilience. She was broken, yes, but not defeated. There was a spark of life still burning within her, a flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. I found myself drawn into conversations with her, tentative at first, then gradually deepening, exploring the wreckage of our past, the reasons behind her betrayal, the pain it had caused. There were no accusations, no recriminations, just a raw, honest exchange between two people who had once loved each other, who had shared a life, who had been irrevocably changed by the events of the past few months. In those conversations, I began to see a glimmer of understanding, a hint of forgiveness. The anger that had consumed me for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a weary acceptance of the past and a tentative hope for the future. The road ahead was still uncertain, the wounds still deep, but there was a possibility, however faint, of healing, of redemption, of finding a way to move forward, together or apart. The visits to Eleonora became a strange ritual, a pilgrimage to a place of shared pain and tentative healing. The silence that had once filled the house began to give way to hesitant conversations, awkward at first, then gradually flowing more freely. We spoke of mundane things, the weather, the news, the changing seasons. We spoke of our children, their lives disrupted by the fallout of our broken marriage, their innocence tarnished by the shadow of betrayal. And sometimes, cautiously, we spoke of ourselves, of the past, the present, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Eleonora, stripped of her social facade, was a revelation. The woman I had known, the confident, vivacious social butterfly, had been replaced by a quieter, more introspective version of herself. There was a vulnerability in her eyes, a fragility that I had never seen before. But there was also a strength, a resilience that surprised and impressed me. She spoke of her regrets, her shame, the pain she had caused. She didn't make excuses, didn't try to justify her actions. She simply acknowledged her mistakes, her failings, the weakness that had led her astray. There was a raw honesty in her words, a sincerity that I found both disarming and compelling. I, in turn, spoke of my own pain, my anger, the destructive path I had taken in the pursuit of revenge. I confessed my doubts, my fears, the guilt that gnawed at me for the damage I had caused. I didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't expect absolution. I simply offered my truth, my vulnerability, in the hope that it might bridge the chasm that separated us. The conversations were not always easy. There were moments of tension, of anger, of tears, but there were also moments of shared understanding, of unexpected connection, of a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, we could find a way to salvage something from the wreckage of our past. We were not the same people we had been before. The betrayal had changed us irrevocably. But in the crucible of that pain, something new was emerging. A tentative bond forged in the fires of adversity, a shared understanding that transcended the anger and the hurt.